Have you ever wanted to escape car payments? Well, if so, you might be in luck because we are looking at the 2015 Ford Escape, and we are going to decide if it's a buy or if it's a bust. Today we're looking at the 2015 Ford Escape with over 130,000 miles for this high miles review. Ford completely redesigned the Escape in 2013 to make it a little bit more civilized. They've made some updates along the way, some good, some bad. We're going to talk about it. We're going to go over the good, the bad, the ugly, and check out all the common problems on these Escapes. Starting up front on this Ford Escape, you can notice that one headlight has been replaced, one has not, but the one that hasn't needs to be because it is completely fogged up. It's really starting to spider crack and it looks like the plastic is getting brittle. At first glance, the paint and everything is shining nicely up here until you get up close. You start to notice just a little bit along the front edge there, and I almost can't even show you on camera until I lift the hood. But there is some rust starting on the underside of the hood. So that's definitely something you want to check out. Moving back the side, speaking of rust, you want to always look at the crimp welds, which are just right below the door underneath the plastic down there. You'll notice that there is some rust starting along there as well. That's pretty typical among all cars, but you can tell that this car has been around some salt. Moving around the back of the Escape, I actually don't have a whole lot more to talk about beyond the rust and headlights. The plastic has held up fairly well. The wheels look nice. Paint is shining, no chipping, peeling, or anything like that really to speak of that I would consider something that you need to be concerned with if you're looking at a used one of these. Under the hood of this 2015 Escape, we have Ford's 1.6 liter EcoBoost engine that pumps out a whopping 178 horsepower and 184 pound-feet of torque. Now, before we get into the problems on this engine, I want to just touch on the two other engines that Ford offered for this year. Yes, they offered 3 different engines. The base engine really was the 2.5 liter, which was a sort of standard engine, non-turbo, and it is by far the most reliable engine that Ford offered in the Escapes. It was only offered in the front wheel drive and in the lower trims, and it is a really solid engine that is known for being very reliable. The next one would be the 2 liter engine, which was kind of the top engine that you could get, and this 1.6 liter was in the middle, but the 2 liter and the 1.6 are both kind of similar in terms of reliability. The 2 liter had some common EcoBoost turbo problems and things. Not going into all the details on them, but it wasn't the most reliable engine ever. And now to the 1.6 liter, and my determination on this engine is generally below average in reliability, and we're going to talk about why. Now, when Ford redesigned the Escape for 2013, it was a pretty big departure from the previous generations, and they had a lot of problems for the 13 and 14 model years. Now, this is the 2015, and they supposedly fixed all the problems, but unfortunately, they didn't fix them 100%, even though generally the problems were improved. The number one problem, I always like to start off with the most important problem, and that is coolant leaks and overheating issues. The water pump on these engines tends to fail. The coolant expansion tank tends to fail and cause leaks, and if these engines are overheated, they tend to have a catastrophic failure where the cylinder walls and things will crack inside and cause coolant to get in, and you have to replace the engine. That was very common between 2013 and 14, slightly improved for 2015, but it is still one of the number one complaints that I see out there. If you can catch the coolant leaks ahead of time and it doesn't overheat, then you're more than likely going to be okay, but it's still a pretty big problem. Next up is this engine does have a timing belt on it, and it's actually one of the better maintenance intervals for timing belts that I have seen. Now, this is an interference engine, which means if the timing belt breaks, you're probably going to blow the engine. So you do want to keep up on these, but it's rated for 150,000 miles. So if you're buying one that's used and it's already been done, you are pretty well set to go for at least another 150,000 miles, which is good news. A lot of the engines on the market were only like good from 70 to 100,000 miles for timing belts, so the Ford rated it at 150 is pretty good. Now let's move on to the 6-speed transmission. Ford tried to rival Nissan with having the most unreliable transmissions on the market for a few years there, especially those 2013 and 14 years. And they made it, again, slightly better, but transmission complaints are not uncommon on these cars. From torque converter to outright transmission failure, while they aren't the most unreliable transmission, it is still a big complaint from a lot of Escape owners, and it's probably less than average as far as reliability. Now, this is an all-wheel drive model. If you're looking at an all-wheel drive, there's one thing that you should be aware of, and that is there's a clutch inside the rear differential. They make a service kit for it, but you'll notice at slow speeds and you're turning sharply, the wheels kind of catch. This is how common sort of on a lot of all-wheel drive vehicles that you'll feel that a little bit, but it's exaggerated on this. They do make a service kit that you can buy that's not terribly expensive to help prevent that or to fix it, but it is something that you want to keep an eye on. As we go to open up the door, I love the outside keypad, so you don't have to have a key with you. Ford is really smart on that, and more auto manufacturers should have done that, although I heard Ford is doing away with it. As we open up to the interior, I gotta say, so far the wear is pretty good on this. Now, this is a little bit newer car and not as high mileage as some of the vehicles that we review, but it's pretty good on the inside. One of the big things I noticed, I actually like these door panels, but they put the noisiest piece that you touch right here. You might be able to hear it. And that part just feels like cheap, and everything else feels nice. It's soft to the touch, probably one of the better ones in the class of cheap, small SUVs. But this right here is a letdown because it's the thing you touch the most on the door panel, and it makes noise and kind of creaks every time you touch it. The seats and the dash all held up pretty nicely. I don't see any excessive wear on the inside. Now, while this interior has held up pretty well, the one thing I do notice on these, and this car is pretty clean, but the seats tend to get stained a little bit more easily, I think, especially like in the cloth trim than some other cars out there. They just kind of look worn out over time. But the rest of the interior actually, like I said, really is pretty nice for this class of vehicle. The big thing that you gotta pay attention to on these is the radios and sync system from Microsoft is not known to be reliable. Most people just end up putting aftermarket radios in because they're pretty much obsolete and very clunky at this point. Ford had a problem with a lot of radios back around this generation. The radios just failing and going bad. So that's something you're gonna wanna look into. If you notice the radio isn't playing, you might just have to put a new radio inside of it to get past that. All the electronics, windows, everything like that are generally pretty reliable in these. The one thing is AC. The AC compressors can fail. It's not overly common, but I have seen that several times. In the back seat here, you're definitely in a small SUV, but my legroom is good. My headroom is pretty great, actually. And the seat is generally comfortable for a second row. I'm not wowed by it, but it's okay. The first thing that I did notice is when you go to shut these doors, they did use cheaper materials on these back door panels, and you can really tell they feel pretty cheap, and you can tell that they cut some corners there. Otherwise, I think I could ride back here for a road trip. It's not bad, it's not great, but I think it's probably a little bit above average for your overall comfort and space in the rear of the Escape. We are pulling out on the road in our little Escape. First thing I noticed right off the bat is the 1-2 shift from first to second is stiff. Not like slipping or anything, but just a very, very firm shift. We'll see how it goes up through the gears the rest of the way here. Everything else feels pretty good, I think. Just that first one, just a little bit tough on that. We are on a back winding road, and honestly feels pretty good so far. I don't hate the power. It's not like a lot, but it is decent. Little pull. Yeah, it's slow. It's definitely slow. What would you expect? It's a 1.6 liter. It's almost a motorcycle engine. Yeah, this is, like I said, the all-wheel drive model. And the fuel mileage on these is like 22 and 29, which is not bad for an all-wheel drive SUV. You can get another mile per gallon or so if you go with just the front-wheel drive model. One of the things I'm noticing as we're driving is there is a little bit of noise, not so much from the outside. It's actually fairly quiet, but the wheel bearing is making some noise in the rear, it sounds like. That is a common problem with these, a little bit more common than it should be, to have wheel bearings fail. And there is lights on for traction control and ABS due to that failing wheel bearing. One other thing on the suspension that goes bad prematurely is rear shocks. Rear shocks have a tendency to start leaking and just fail altogether. Not the worst expense in the world, but it is all too common on these cars. I would say the overall driving experience is pretty good. It goes around corners really nicely. The steering is tight. All of those things. It actually is a pretty pleasant car to drive. I don't hate the fuel mileage. Power is not great, but I wasn't really expecting anything different. Back from the test drive, and now we got to decide if the Escape is a buy or if it's a bust. Some of the things I was surprised about is really it drives nice. The interior, the styling, all that stuff I like overall, especially for this small type entry-level SUV. The fuel mileage is pretty decent for this car, and I think you get a lot for the money on these. Speaking of money, these cars run about $6,000 or $7,000, depending on where you are in the country. Before I rule on the 2015, I will say that the 13 and 14 Escapes are busts. There is a long list of problems. They had a ton of recalls, and they are not reliable enough for me to recommend. And even though we're not specifically reviewing them, they look almost identical, and a lot of people will confuse them. So I just want to be clear, if you're looking at a 13 and 14, I would pass. And now on to this 2015 with the 1.6 liter, and it is a bust. Unfortunately, it's just not reliable enough for me to recommend you to buy at higher mileage, even though there is a lot to love about the Escape. I have seen lots of people out there who have gotten 200,000 miles with no issues on them, and they love the cars and say that they're bulletproof, but the long list of problems that are reported really doesn't lie either. If you have a Ford Escape, I want to hear your experience, what problems you've had, if you've shared some of the ones that I brought up, or if you've had a perfect experience and it's been the best car you've ever owned. Tell me all about it down below. Thanks for watching.
Yeah. Please tell me that I can't, that I won't, that I fail, that I'll never make it out, yeah. Please tell me all the bad, never good, fill my head full of every single doubt, yeah. Please say any negative thoughts, I pop off when I hear people say I cannot. I get off to the thought of proving everyone wrong, I won't stop to the top, so